The following stories are from the paranormal subreddit. Each of them is told as a true story. I grew up in a densely forested, rural area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, 10 at the time of this story, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened on was a very rare find and the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim in and had a nice, soft, mossy bank on either side to rest on after we tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads, and no mosquitoes because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack the lunch the next day so we could have a picnic on the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning, we set out for the woods at around 1 p.m., planning to have the picnic first and swim after. We entered at the same spot we had the previous day and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before. So, being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around there for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set back out to find the creek. As we walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about a half hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an entire overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, bathtub, all sitting arranged together and covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird shit like this in the middle of the woods, so we just walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home, or out of the woods at least. I told her we should follow the sun and eventually we would come up on a road or someone's property where we could find help. She insisted on another way, and we began yelling at each other out of the fear and, let's be honest, little girl bossiness. I told her if she thought she was so right, she should just go her way and we would see who got out first. So we split up. Now, as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat and also an idiot. Worst possible thing we could have done. Not 10 minutes after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend, deciding to go my way after all. I slow down so she can catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was matched my pace. I slow down, it slows down. I stop, it stops. This went on for hours. The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head or there was really something following me. I picked up a big stick, swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy if I had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, I came up on something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the setting sun, west the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and just screamed my little heart out while smacking my whoop-ass stick repeatedly into the ground. As I tried to collect myself, I heard the footsteps again, walking up on me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could. No answer. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Now, this is the truly horrifying part, which I typically omit while telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to see the darkest, deepest cloud I have ever seen in my life. In the middle it was so black, it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars for too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sound of bells was coming through the hole in the cloud. They were deafeningly loud. I mean, really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sense of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in all my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away from whatever the hell that cloud was, no one would ever see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run toward the thing chasing behind me either, though. so I made a sharp right and took off away from both. It was now completely dark, and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through the branches, wheezing and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour, until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard all the air in my lungs was knocked out of me. As I lay there trying to recover, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark, and I realized what had made me go ass over teeth was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough, it did. I walked up over a hill, about a mile to the back of the farmhouse, explained what had happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I had ever been in my life. But I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through my front door. My friend had gotten back shortly after we split and figured I had as well, so hadn't told anybody I was lost, and my family just figured I was still out in the dark, which wasn't uncommon for me. They were shocked when I walked in beat up and crying. Nobody had been looking for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late. My daughter's imaginary friend. In 2013, my wife and I divorced, and we both moved into separate homes. The divorce went well, and we are still good friends to this day, partly because we have a daughter together. We agreed to split custody over our daughter, and I rented an old house in a historic district in the city. It was a very pretty home, built in 1935, but kept up very well. I would have my daughter 2 weeks at a time, and she had a bedroom in the back of the house. She was 3 years old at the time, and I kept noticing her talking to her friend. One day, I found her in a little closet talking to someone, and I remembered her saying she was talking to another little girl named Betty. I have no idea where she heard the name Betty, as she was only 3 years old, but I just chalked it all up to a child's vivid imagination. Keep in mind, I'm a single dad to a little girl. I really have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to dressing, hair, or just little girl stuff in general. Her mother is good at that stuff, but not me. I put my daughter to bed one night after her bath. I remember brushing her hair that night, but that was all I did. The very next morning, her mom came to pick her up from my house, and my daughter was just waking up. Her mom went back to her bedroom to find my daughter's hair was fixed into 2 perfect French braids. Her mom was real proud of me at first that I had done her hair so cute, but I told her I didn't, and I couldn't do that. I can't even braid her hair, much less do perfect French braids. We asked our daughter how her hair got fixed, and she told us that Betty had done it during the night. I broke the contract on the rental agreement and moved out within the next month. I saw my grandfather at his own funeral. My grandfather died in 1995 due to emphysema and other health concerns. He was in his early 60s and left us prematurely, as he had many people who loved and depended on him, including many young grandchildren. I was only 4 years old, almost 5 at the time when he passed, and I don't remember much from this darker time in life, but I remember his funeral extremely vividly. I was in a funeral home that has multiple parlors and many hallways throughout the building. I remember being outside of his parlor and seeing him across the room. We locked eyes. I walked over to him. After all, he was my grandpa, and I did not realize at the time that he had passed. We began our usual, as we were 2 peas in a pod and had a special relationship, and we held hands and walked through the halls. Much of the conversation I do not recall, but I do remember showing him the lounge area, as that was my favorite place to be. What, with all the snacks and vending machines? As we approached the area that we had met, we stopped, and he said to me, "Michael, I have to go now." He had vanished, literally leaving my hand empty in the air. I can still see my empty hand and remember the shock and confusion. The part that helps me think this was an authentic experience, and this is something my grandmother, aunt, and mother remember well and were concerned for years about. As I approach the open casket, my mother picks me up. I see Grandpa Leroy there, in his piece, and I begin, confused, to relentlessly ask why Grandpa was in a casket and what is wrong with him. My mother told me crying, as I remember this clearly, "Michael, honey, he is dead. He's gone. He's not coming back." I was in disbelief, arguing, no, I just saw him. He's outside. After this, I remember all of us crying together. But that is all. I never spoke about it until I was 12 or 13 years old. I was at my grandmother's, and her health was wavering at the time. I had been thinking about it a lot with her being in that state and having memories of my experience. And I finally broke down and told them what I had remembered. Again, we cried, and they didn't believe I could remember that, or that I had held on to it through all those years of my childhood. They, in a way, directly corroborate my experience for me, at least solidifying it in my head as a final goodbye from one of my favorite human beings. As they remember the scene at the casket, they were always too afraid to ask me about it, maybe to protect me from my emotional anguish. My grandmother, for the remaining year or so she was with us, would ask me to tell her this story anytime I'd visit her. She also claims to have woken up one day, feeling my grandfather laying next to her. She said she could feel it was him, as if she went to bed next to him and woke up together. She never told that to anyone until I had shared my story. I hope anyone reading this enjoyed the story. It's one I will never forget. She is real, a La Llorona experience. This happened to me when I was about 11 years old. It was the 90s. I have lived my whole life in El Paso, Texas. The culture is rich in folklore and religious beliefs. Many Hispanic families have stories of the paranormal. One popular legend is the legend of the Weeping Woman, aka La Llorona. The legend of La Llorona, Spanish for the Weeping Woman, has been a part of Hispanic culture in the Southwest since the days of the conquistadors. The tall, thin spirit is said to be blessed with natural beauty and long, flowing black hair. Wearing a white gown, she roams the rivers and creeks, wailing into the night and searching for children to drag, screaming, to a watery grave. No one really knows when the legend of La Llorona began, or where it originated, though the tales vary from source to source. The one common thread is that she is the spirit of a doomed mother who drowned her children and now spends eternity searching for them in rivers and lakes. One night, just like any other night, I lived in a trailer with my mom and dad. My youngest brother was staying with my aunt this night. I fell asleep watching Jay Leno, as usual, and when I woke up, I was on the sofa in the living room. The time was 4 a.m., which illuminated from the stove in the kitchen. The television was off, and normally I had a light on, but this time it was pitch black. I woke up, and I heard a horrible screaming that was coming from far in the distance. The screaming was coming from a ditch that was a few feet from my home. I heard it, and I thought I was hearing things. I'd asked myself, am I dreaming? Then I started to hear the animals outside howling and whimpering. These animals that I speak of are cats and dogs. As the screaming got closer, the animals continued to cry. The screaming was something I had never experienced before. It sounded like I was in a big hallway, and a woman was screaming her guts out down that hallway. Then, in all the screaming, I started to make out words. These words being said by whoever this was at 4 a.m. screaming their guts out shocked me. The woman was saying, "Oh, my children." In a huge panic, I quickly got up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen, which was right next to where I was asleep. I turned the closet light on and looked around. The screaming didn't stop. In fact, the screaming only got louder and closer. I questioned my sanity at that moment. Was I going crazy or hearing things? Then I thought to myself, this is real. The animals are responding to it in a negative way. So I did what any other 11-year-old boy would do in a moment like this. I ran to my mom and dad's room. I reached for my mom and shook her awake wildly. She woke up slowly, and to my amazement, the screaming faded away as she awoke. I thought to myself, what the heck is going on? I told my mother, "Mom, do you hear that screaming and the crying lady?" My mom was half asleep as she said, "Go back to sleep. It's most likely just your imagination." I told her, "No, this is real. Please listen. You don't hear that?" My mom quickly just said, "You're dreaming, so go back to sleep. It's going to be okay." By then, the screaming had faded long away, as if whoever was screaming knew that an adult was awake. I was terrified as I returned to the living room and quickly turned on the television, as I left most of the lights on as well. I didn't go back to sleep until the sun came up. I couldn't believe what I heard and witnessed. I was treated like a crazy person whenever I told my story. It got so bad that I kept my experience to myself. To this day, I don't know what people think of my experience. I know what I heard. A couple of years later, it happened to me again, but that's a whole other story I will share later.